Every time somebody sees a drone flying inside the boundary of the Wichita Mountain Wildlife Refuge, I get Facebook messages asking if it was me. No, it wasn't me. As time goes on, more and more individuals have drones and are looking to capture the beauty of Southwest Oklahoma. Unfortunately, majority do not understand the rules, or they just blatantly ignore them. I started flying a couple of years ago, and I really wasn't on anybody's radar until I flew over Medicine Park over the crowds of people at the annual Park Stomp Festival. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but this was actually super illegal. I had a few drone enthusiasts who understood the laws reach out and give me links to study. As I read these regulation pages and studied the laws for the FAA Part 107, I learned that I had actually broken several laws over the years on accident. One thing I have never done, however, is fly my drone over the restricted Fort Sill or Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge airspace. In this quick video, I'm going to show you where you can legally fly your drone in the Wichita Mountains because there are some really great spots to do so. We will take a deeper look at the airspace at the Quartz Mountain area because you can actually get in some real trouble there if you don't follow the rules. To understand where you can fly responsibly, you need to be able to read these charts. Now, you can also download apps like Air Control, a few others that'll actually show your GPS location in reference to open or closed airspace. It also shows you restricted airspace, allowed heights, etc. Now, in some instances, you can request waivers to fly into different types of airspace, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. I'm really targeting recreational flyers with this video, as those of you who already have your FAA 107 should have a solid understanding of this stuff already. Alright, let's dive in. I will try my best to keep this as simple as possible, so bear with me. This is a screenshot of a sectional aeronautical chart for the Wichita Mountains. Now, I know it looks extremely complicated as the airspace above the Wichita Mountains is quite complex with our wilderness areas, national parks, restricted areas, and a couple of military installations. I'm going to focus on the areas that you need to be familiar with. Let's start with the eastern half of the Wichita Mountains from roughly Cooperton and Snyder to Elgin and Lawton. This here is the boundary of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. This airspace is 100% off limits starting at the surface. Now this is the entire boundary for Fort Sill, and this airspace is also 100% off limits starting at the surface as well. Now I'll show you where some of the nearby towns are in this map, just so you can kind of see where things are, because it can be difficult to read if you haven't seen this before. Here's where Medicine Park is located. We got Mears up here. Then of course southwest of the refuge we have Indiahoma, and then we have Cashier. For reference, inside the border of the refuge, here is Quanah-Parker Lake, Elmer Thomas Lake, and then finally Caddo Lake out in Sharon's Garden. The refuge shares boundaries with Fort Sill, and then the rest is private property. The airspace above and outside of the refuge boundary is a mixture of restricted zones. Now, unlike these areas here where the restricted airspace starts at the surface, these here all have restrictions beginning at 500 feet AGL. So let's talk about AGL versus MSL real quick. AGL, or above ground level, is your altitude above the current ground level, while MSL, or mean sea level, is your true altitude above a standardized sea level. Just remember that you can't fly above 400 feet AGL or above ground level. Now, if you fly on a mountain, that 400 feet would change with the elevation and the curvature of said mountain. For instance, let's take a look at Haley Peak, which sits just outside the northwest boundary of the refuge. Its summit sits at an elevation of 2,481 feet MSL, or mean sea level. So technically, you could fly your drone up to 2,881 feet mean sea level from the summit of Haley Peak. So in the case of Haley Peak, its MSL, or the mean sea level height, is 2,481 feet, but its AGL, or above ground level, would actually be 0 at the summit surface. Now just remember, if you're flying on flat land below Haley Peak, you would have to stay within the 400 feet AGL. Now I'll show you a few places I have flown outside the refuge boundaries. Now remember, these are all over private property, so if you fly in these locations, make sure you stay away from homes, people, cattle, stuff like that. This is also a pretty big gamble, because if you do lose your drone for any reason, it's going to crash on private property, and it will be entirely up to the landowner whether you get it back or not. In these next few clips, I will show you where I flew in reference to the boundary of the refuge. We'll start here on the northwest side of the refuge since I just finished talking about Haley Peak. Here we are, flying above Haley Peak, looking to the south. If we freeze it, we can highlight where the boundary is for the refuge. Alright, for this one we'll move just a couple of miles south and check out Baker Peak. The boundary here is slightly difficult to see due to the vegetation. In this clip, we're going to look slightly south of Baker Peak. Now, the fence is much easier to see here. I do want to point out an error that's on the official charts here. So Baker Peak actually sits inside the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. But if you look at this chart, it will show that Baker Peak is outside of the boundary. So this isn't the case. This should be labeled Haley Peak, as it is the mountain that sits in this exact location. On the northern rim of the refuge, a popular spot to fly is just south of Mears, below Mount Sheridan, just off of Highway 115. Now, Mount Sheridan is tricky because the southern half of it sits on refuge property and the northern half sits on private property. It can be difficult to see the boundary due to the boulders and the trees, but it's there. Another great spot is near Robinson's Landing on the north side of Lake Latonka. If we freeze it, this isn't exact, but you can see the refuge boundary a ways off below the mountains. You can also fly along Medicine Creek and get some amazing views of some of those cascades. You can fly over Lake Latonka as well, and the boundary is nearly impossible to see because of the trees, but you can make out the Mount Scott Fire Road the closer you get to the refuge boundary. Now, lastly, let's look at Medicine Park. You have to tread very carefully here, as Medicine Park is tucked away right on the border of Fort Sill and the refuge. Looking west, you can see the Fort Sill boundary in red, and then the refuge boundary in yellow. The aquarium sits pretty much on the boundary. Now, with any of these, geofencing should kick in and keep you from accidentally flying into any restricted areas that are nearby. If you're not familiar with what geofencing is, it's technically a virtual wall that will restrict the movement of your drone. It uses a combination of GPS, your drone software, a few other things. There are a few drones on the market that don't use geofencing, but I personally like having that capability on mine so I don't accidentally fly into airspace that I shouldn't be flying into. Alright, let's turn our attention now to the western half of the Wichita Mountains. This airspace is slightly more complicated. On this chart you can see Lake Altus, Tom Steed Lake, and a lot of different airspace designations above them. Let's focus on the Quartz Mountain area first. This falls under Class E and Class C airspace. So how does this affect you? Well, if you stay below 400 feet, it doesn't. The Class E airspace starts at 700 feet above the ground. So if you're hiking some of those peaks in the Quartz Mountains and flying your drone, this here is where you'd be located at. Now, if you're flying near Granite, like Walsh Mountain, Headquarters Mountain, this is where you'll be at. So the outer ring of the Altus Air Force Base Class C airspace begins at 3,000 feet MSL and 3,500 feet MSL respectively. So if you're on the summit of King Mountain, you're already at 2,411 feet MSL, but 0 feet AGL, or above ground. At this point, Class E airspace would begin at 700 feet above you, which would also be 3,111 feet MSL. You would be permitted to fly your drone up to 2,811 feet MSL. So why is it important to stay within the 400-foot limit here? Because Class C airspace begins at 3,500 feet MSL. That means if you breach the 400-foot allowance, you have just a few hundred feet between you and any potential aircraft flying in and out of Altus Air Force Base. This is a fairly active airspace as well. You'll see lots of military aircraft doing touch and goes. My kids and I were climbing Baldy Peak in the Quartz Mountains one day and noticed this Chinook flying pretty low. This happens often. There's a lot of military traffic in this area, so make sure if you are flying and see other aircraft that you do move out of their way or even land for the time being. Now, I do want to make another point concerning MSL versus AGL. MSL never changes. AGL, however, changes depending on where you're at. This is what the Class E airspace above King Mountain looks like. Notice how Class E airspace changes with the curvature of the land, while Class C remains the same. Alright, finally, let's take a look at the Tom Steed Lake area. This is another one that straddles different types of airspace. Once again, you are concerned with staying within 400 feet above the ground. For the western half of the area, it will be Class E starting at 1,200 feet AGL or 2,630 feet MSL, and then it will become Class C airspace at 3,500 feet MSL. So if you're flying near the western half of Tom Steed Lake, you'll have zero issues flying within 400 feet. If you are on the eastern side of the lake or flying over in the Glen Mountains area, you can fly up within 400 feet above the highest portion of those mountains with no issues. Well, I hope this video made sense to you. I hope you're not even more confused than you were before you started watching this. Now, I do recommend that you take the time to study for and even take the FAA Part 107. It's a great certification, and it never hurts to know all the rules and the regulations while you're out there flying. As you can see, it's absolutely imperative that we as unmanned pilots follow all of these rules and regulations, especially in the case of Quartz Mountain area with Altus Air Force Base nearby. It's pretty easy to get yourself into a jam out there, so you need to be very careful. So, long story short, don't fly in the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, don't fly on Fort Sill, don't go above 400 feet AGL, fly responsibly and fly safe. Well, maybe I'll see you out there sometime. Have a good one.